Welcome to Reconsider. I'm Bill Hartman. This is the podcast to challenge you to ask better questions, to look beyond traditional models of thinking and arrive at better health and fitness solutions.
Little echo chamber of you and I and the people in the network and stuff like that. Speaking of the network, UHP Plus going live. Yeah, UHP Plus, the membership subscription version of what we ended up building with the UHP network is going live this week. Tomorrow, actually, which will be the 31st of May. First full week will be Monday. That's the first. Wait, no, Monday's the third. Okay.
Yep.
Monday, June 3rd. So if you're listening to this around then, you can still get in at the promotional rate that we have for the early access people. If you would like to try to jump in on that, it's quite a big savings. So if you are interested in that, head to the website. Today we're going to talk about on the network we post a question or poll to see if people had anything that they wanted to talk about on the podcast and things that they hear a lot from clients and patients and colleagues. And someone had mentioned something about rolling and different types of like body awareness, body mapping techniques. And, you know, that when you think about a lot of this stuff, you think about like Tai Chi, you think about the work of like Moshe Feldenkrais, you think about Frederick Alexander, I believe, was the guy that came up with the whole, in the 1800s, the whole Alexander technique, which is like, you know, center of gravity, base of support, center of mass, positioning of joints. We can even get into like a little bit of that. There's some other schools of thought, and
you have to throw PNF in there because
PNF, Cabot Boss.
Yeah, but see, like, you know, people look at PNF and then they associate it with like stretching because it got categorized as PNF. It's like PNF is an entire system of treatment and training. People don't really realize that.
And even
rolling is in there, right?
Yeah, rolling
for a reason.
I think
for a reason.
Center of gravity and center of like, what's it called? Instantaneous center of rotation. Is that right? Is that what they call it?
They will make reference to that when they're talking about joint positions and movements. Sure.
Yeah, I think that was something that Shirley Sarman would write about a lot. So that comes to mind. I think points of instantaneous center of rotation is something that I took from reading her work. Yeah, so I was talking about base support, points of instantaneous center of rotation, which is actually a really cool concept because it's talking about like a joint, how something rotates within the center of a joint and how that position changes over time. So it is sort of like a four-dimensional representation of joint position, if you perceive it that way.
It is somewhat useful as a descriptor. It's kind of like looking at joints as levers. It's like, is it useful as a descriptor? It helps us create a picture, but is it accurate? Probably not.
Yeah.
Because then people are chasing things. Like they're saying, oh, we have to get it in this position only. And it's like, the joint sort of takes care of itself if you have access to if you have access to all of the motions that should be available. It's like it takes care of itself. It's not something that you can't measure it, really.
Right.
You can't measure it. So don't worry about it so much. And I tend to not spend a lot of time worrying about things that I don't have an accurate measure for. That's why I got a list of dirty words that I just don't use because they're not helpful. But if we want to get back to the topic at hand, right? It's like, why are we spending all this time on the ground? For a very good reason.
Yeah.
For a very good reason. Because when we talk about movement, we talk about shape changes. And a lot of situations arise where through repeated behaviors, stress, trying to control your center of gravity in the midst of compensatory activity, we lose the capacity for shape change, and then we lose the ability to produce sensations on our own. And so that's one of the reasons why we rely on certain types of exercises, certain positions that we might use. But the cool thing is that with rolling, we're getting a whole slew of sensations that we normally would not be exposed to. And then that provides us opportunities to change that we
Right.
wouldn't normally get. And so
Yeah, and
so
let's
that's why it's so important.
yeah. And there are a lot of reasons why rolling is has. So I think what we should try to get into a little bit is like the traditional reasons and the approaches that are taken by people in the past who have used rolling. Because when I learned about rolling, it was like segmental rolling and doing a certain progression of lower body rolling and then upper body rolling and then switching that. And
Mm-hmm.
that model, that I now think back toward the model that I learned is like not giving that same sort of progression to everybody for the reasons that they were being given. It doesn't really
Mm-hmm.
make that much sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess maybe we talk about like the traditional representation of segmental rolling and then what's actually happening, or because we're trying to get people to reconsider what they already think they know about rolling, right?
Right. Well, it's not random. First of
Yeah.
all, it's not like, and we always fall into these categorizations in the rehab and fitness industries of everybody needs to be able to do X, and not
Yes.
everybody can, right? Because we're all idiosyncratic in our ability to access certain movements and positions. So there's going to be certain types of activities that will be ideal. And I don't know that there is like a traditional necessarily, other than say something that would be along the lines of classic physical education, martial arts has, like, every martial art will have some exposure to ground-based contacts, because you got to be able to fall, you got to be able to absorb energy from the ground and such, which again, this is teaching you to shape change, because if you can't change shape change and you do hit the ground, tends to result in bad things, right? Too much load, too much stress in one place, and you get injured. So rolling has always been a part of that. But again, this is we talk about like early propulsion being a phase of propulsion where we're actually absorbing energy. It's like, this is actually why I talk about propulsion, because rolling has to follow the same rules, right? So as we're rolling, we're actually absorbing and releasing energy. We're distributing load. So we talk about the distributed yield associated with running, walking, and such. It's like the same thing is happening when we're talking about rolling behaviors on the ground, right? And so that has always been part of it. Now, not described that way, but it does follow the exact same principles as we would say
Yeah.
any other form of propulsion.
I'm trying to think back to, I'm going to take a step back and try to think back to the reasons why, when I was introduced to the concepts of like segmental rolling, why they're being used. A lot of it is like cross connection of the upper and lower half, being able to try to get dynamic stability back in single leg stance. So like if you're stepping over something or walking, something like that. And then usually having that correlate to some form of like quadruped stability test or something. Those are, I'm
See,
thinking about a lot of that from that perspective.
anytime you use the S word, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to middle P,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Anything outside of that is an external rotation bias, and then you're superimposing various degrees of internal rotation and then applying force to the ground and then moving the center of gravity ahead of the point of contact. We don't have to talk about anything funny, other than the fact that, okay, your center of mass is on the ground. It's going to
Yeah.
be in a certain position relative to the ground contact. Okay, so for me to roll in a direction, I have to actually move my center of mass over the point of contact and then get ahead of it, just like taking a step forward. So that's why rolling follows the same rules of propulsion, but it's the shape changing that is most important, because it's the exact same shape changes that you would make if you're walking across the ground. What people
Okay.
don't seem to recognize is, like, this is why we talk about foot contact being so important. It's like, if I get the right foot contacts, I get the behaviors of creating the energy absorption phase, the force production phase into the ground, and then the energy releasing phase that would be in late propulsion,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
Right.
if you think about heel to ankle to toe rocker, if you know that model of thinking of the foot, that is a
Yeah.
roll. It's just on each
It
foot.
is a roll.
Each
It's exactly the same thing,
each
right?
foot rolls just like you would roll on your side.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
So again, all we're talking about is the ability to access relative motion, the ability to produce force into the ground, and the ability to propel yourself forward at a higher rate of velocity. That's literally the same thing. And so what if I am working with an individual and they can't produce those sensations on their own that allows them to change the shape? I would do, as a therapist, I can do manual therapies and I can provide them with those sensations. I can make those changes. We can recapture the relative motions that give them the capacity to absorb energy, produce force, and then release energy. But then how do they do that themselves? So this is why we do activities on the ground. This is why we use different positions. If you look at right side lying from a positional standpoint, it is partway through a roll.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm accessing a certain element of that. Now I look at okay, well, what is the precursor to that position? Like, where would I have to be to eventually rest, apply force down into that position? And so this is when we're talking about short arc, lazy rolling from side lying. It's like I'm moving through a very small excursion of a roll, because what I'm trying to do is I'm actually trying to promote a progressive shape change. If I try to do too much too soon, just like any other activity, so if I try to run before I can walk, that kind of concept, right? I won't be able to make the appropriate shape changes that I need to be able to access the movements that I want to be able to access.
All right. So I'm gonna give an example here. So well, Bill's talking about shape change, and if you just think about like a lump of clay or dough that you're trying to roll out on the table, if I have someone that's compressed from front to back that looks like that, and then I put them on their side, I can get that space to come back to allow for what Bill's talking about, the space to put force down into the ground.
Correct.
So if I need to create the space in order which to put down force and IR down within my base of support, so there each person's max P is where it's supposed to be. Put that on a t-shirt. Is your max P where it's supposed to be? Maybe that'll be one of the shirts that we have in the store that nobody will buy.
It'll be right there with 2 steps forward, 1 step
forward. Yeah. So maybe we'll start making memes on the UHP network.
There you go.
But yeah, so that's what, when Bill's talking about shape change, when Bill's talking about like that middle position, we're trying to allow for the ground to help create the space.
Right. Because that's what the ground does anyway. Yeah.
Because we eliminate a lot of the effect of gravity that you would have on 2 feet.
Correct. We are distributing the stress. We are creating sensations that promote the same shape changes that would happen in upright. See, that's the thing that you want to recognize. It's like, why would I roll around the ground? It's like, because ultimately I want to be up on my 2 feet and still be able to access relative motions, still be able to produce force into the ground, and still be able to release energy. But that requires this shape change. And so we pick rolls that produce the same strategies that we would use upright. And so if you look at, something as simple as some of the armbar variations, all they are is steps forward. Right.
Yeah.
With a different ground contact, so the energy is distributed in a different manner, but it still produces the exact same shapes that I would use to move across the ground if I was standing up and moving on my feet. It's still the same shape change that I would use if I was swimming. That's why the language is funny, right? That's why we call things propulsion, because when we're talking about propulsion, we're talking about the exact same rules, right? ER biases, superimposition of internal rotation, yielding actions of connective tissues. That's the energy absorption phase, right? More internal rotation, more compression, more force into the ground. That's more of the middle propulsive phase. Then I move back towards ER with a reducing amount of IR and a higher velocity as I'm moving in a direction. Those are the late propulsive strategies. All we're talking about is rolling. Okay. Now we have different axes of rolls because we have different internal behaviors that we have to account for. So if we're talking about, say, a dorsal sacral roll, where we're actually on our back rolling from head to tail, right? we have internal behaviors that have to that the internal dynamics have to be able to move upward and downward inside of the axial skeleton. And so if we need to emphasize that element, now we understand like which type of role that we need to start with under that circumstance. So if the vertical component is more important, I'm rolling on my long axis versus rolling straight sideways over the long axis. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then again, depending on what type of an activity that we're doing. So if we were working on changes of direction, like cutting activities, okay, the vertical component of that is reduced relative to jumping up and down or sprinting. Under that circumstance, the internal dynamics have a more up and down, a more vertical component. So we wouldn't use roles like a shoulder roll or something that would be more horizontal necessarily to because it doesn't emphasize the same internal dynamics. So we can be coherent with our programs depending on what the goal is. If I'm working with a sprinter on top speed, I might use certain types of rolls on the long axis, generally speaking, for certain elements of like ground contacts and things like that. But from the internal dynamic standpoint, it's more vertically oriented. It's more straight up and down, right?
Yeah.
So
So
again,
let's
I can
let's
create a
elaborate on
conflict by
that.
well, I just want to say I
So
can create a
yeah.
conflict by using the wrong rolls at the wrong time.
So let's build a for instance. So we've got say
Uh-huh.
we've got a 200-meter runner who's got some like Achilles based issues when they
Uh-huh.
start. They every time they come out of the
Sure.
blocks they feel so that person is probably being shoved very far forward and then they're
Mm-hmm.
outside of their base of support and that
Mm-hmm.
sort of they've lost enough of the space to put stuff down into the ground and now they're getting this like undue twisting at the Achilles and the
At
heel.
the Achilles. Correct.
Okay.
Right.
So and
Yeah.
if I gave that person front to back rolling only, or if I gave that
Mm-hmm.
person only one type of rolling, I could potentially make it worse or better. And let's maybe talk about
Correct.
let's talk about those two scenarios.
Okay, so again, let's use a vertical and an oblique.
Yes.
Okay, so if I was trying to secure a stronger ground contact in internal rotation on this, let's just say it's a right Achilles.
Yeah.
Fair.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to secure more internal rotation, so more straight down into the ground under that circumstance. However, if I have, say, a compensatory external rotation strategy on that side, I know they don't have the internal rotation. So I know I don't have the shape that would allow the pelvis to then allow the hip to push straight down into the ground. So they're going to try to push into the ground with external rotation because it's going all the way to the ground. So I need to promote a shape change in the axial skeleton. We'll use the pelvis as our primary example here.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I would do that is I have to put a downward pressure straight through the pelvis. So this would be straight down in right sideline would promote the I-arch shape of the pelvis. So we think about that being step one. If I can't push straight down, I would be in an ER position. That's going to take me away from midline as I try to push into the ground. All your best injuries come from people trying to push into the ground through an ER shape, right? I have too much external rotation. All your biceps, femoris, hamstring strains, all your sprained ankles, all your patellofemoral stuff. Those are all ER representations where people are trying to push into the ground, right? But if I use the ground and I use the force into the ground inside lying, I can actually promote the shape change. So you got your towel roll.
Yep.
So lay the flat towel roll first. I tip it up on side, and then that restores the AP dimension that gets me the internal rotation capacity back. So I've gone from a supine position where I was flat as a pancake front to back. I turn on my side. Now I get the anterior posterior expansion. I can now push into the ground.
So the superimposition. So if I was in right side lying, so just to kind of give people an example of that. So what they could potentially do in right side lying is have ground contact against a wall with their right foot, correct?
Yes.
to
Correct.
create if I have the medial aspect of the foot, I can then actually drive IR through that right side, which is now being given
Yes.
space and sideline.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
then we, even in the recon program, we do things like step overs, which are a roll
Correct.
where you
Yes.
have that foot contact against a wall and you step through. So I've
Correct.
built it like backtracking a little bit, create the space and sideline, get the
Hmm.
foot contacts. If they
Hmm.
can't achieve the foot contacts, you might need to call in someone with manual skills
Hmm.
to get the foot shape back,
Hmm.
because it's just we're shape
Right.
changing the foot just like we would shape change the axial
Right.
skeleton. And
Right.
then the thing you could do to try to complete this intervention would be these step over type of drills that are rolling drills.
Right. You're actually stepping through middle propulsion in sideline, and it actually looks like you're taking a step forward. Right. So
I'll
we're
throw a little
actually
video overlay on this while we're
okay.
doing that.
That'd be
Yeah.
awesome. No, it's like you can see that we're actually stepping into an early representation. We're stepping through middle. There's where we're going to get our change in the AP diameter of the axial skeleton, and then we step through into the energy releasing position. So again, take a standing step forward, lay down on your side, and you have a roll. Like
Yeah.
literally, that's what we're talking about under this circumstance. So again, this is why we would have to choose the appropriate activity to produce the appropriate shape.
So the
If
hope
we
there would
were,
be
go ahead.
at the end of this, if I had a 200-meter sprinter, right Achilles
Mhm,
pain out of the blocks,
mhm,
I'm thinking that I don't really have the ability to put the IR down into the ground. So that's just this point. That would
mhm.
mean that the point at which they're trying to force the IR into the ground would be at the Achilles, right? Instead of through the foot. Like that's the point of failure in the link
It's
there.
where the greatest degree of twist would be.
Yes. So that is the instead of there being the
Yes.
greatest degree of pressure and twist at the foot driving into the ground in max P,
Hmm.
it's through
Right.
the ankle Achilles
What's
tendon area.
distributed. So we have an IR shape of the pelvis, which is a force producing pelvis. We have the ability of the femur to turn inward. We have the ability of the tibia to turn inward. We have the ability to put the force through the ground at max propulsion, where the greatest release of energy would actually take place.
Yeah. So that
So
wave that you're
so
talking about can't occur anymore.
right,
So
right,
it's
right.
focal in that one spot and it hurts.
Correct. And
Okay.
and it's unfortunate that everything else was E hard, and then we need a straight down force that's going through a twisted representation. That's why you get that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you can see, and it's not always going to manifest in the Achilles. It could manifest in the knee. It could
Could
manifest
be
in
the
the hip. It
knee,
could be in the
right?
neck. It could be their eye. It could be their vision.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
I
don't
mean, it's
get.
probably
Let's
less
not get too
likely.
wild and crazy there.
Or it's
Um,
right TMJ. Like
yeah,
you get
yeah,
that stuff sometimes.
yeah. But now let's go to another scenario. Okay, so
Sure.
that's kind of like straight ahead, pushing straight down into the ground kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But what do we do? What do we do when we're moving on more oblique axes? So this would be like a sharp cut or a change of direction. So if we're looking at the axial skeleton and what the axial skeleton has to do, now we're talking about rolling over one shoulder. So now we're rolling on an oblique axis, which again will match the actual helical angle that we're using to push into the ground. So these are the shape changes that we would need for changes of direction. And so this is why those types of rolls then become important, because we can again, we're using the same shape change through the ground. We're using the ground as the mobilization. We're using the internal dynamics. We're using the physical shape change that would be associated with a ground contact that you're going to put outside of your center of gravity into the ground and push away and change directions. It's the
Right.
same thing. It's the
And
same
to
thing.
and respecting structure and some of the the foundational principles of the model when it comes to archetypes, you would want to shoulder roll differently for narrows versus wides.
Correct. Because they're going to roll on different axes.
Right. So a narrow shoulder roll is going to be one where you put your arm between your legs as you're going over because it's on a
Correct.
more narrow axis. And a
Correct.
wider shoulder roll would be an arm reaching out to the side. And
Yes.
I can throw videos of that up in here as well. I'm
Yeah.
creating an editing mess for myself, but I'll
but
do it because
but it will
these
be
are good
useful.
examples. Yeah,
But it will be
these are good examples.
useful. Yeah, and it's like so. And again, you think about the archetypes, and then certain types of structures that select people towards certain types of activities. So if we were like a 200-meter runner, okay, so they have to run a curve, which is actually a series of cuts, but they're very shallow cuts. And so they're going to turn on a more vertical axis. So they're going to use a narrow type of a roll under most circumstances. And then if we're talking about, say, a basketball player or a football player that has to make sharper changes of direction, they are going to be on a much more horizontally oriented helical axis. They're going to perform a different type of roll, which again, here's your editing nightmare of throwing in one of those for me so we can see the difference in how we would actually set the roll up, because that's
Right.
going to determine what the outcome would be.
Okay, so let me clarify. Based on what I was saying earlier, I made it seem like you would only want to roll a narrow individual in a certain way. But you could roll, in your basketball example, you could roll for performance reasons. You could roll a narrow basketball player with a wider roll. Is that what you're saying
Yes,
or not really?
no.
Okay.
What I'm saying is the activity itself would select, but see the body type would follow. The problem that we run into, okay, because of the number of people that are exposed to certain types of sports, we're talking about like the highest level where literally a body type is selected. Like
Yes.
you don't see too many um, wide ISA 200-meter sprinters.
Right. I would
Okay,
say none.
right.
I'd say you see none.
Well, but now if we're talking about high school athletes,
Yeah.
okay, because of the broad spectrum, we would see potentially short, stocky kids that are relatively fast for high school. Well, they get to do that kind of stuff. However, their turns are going to be different than we would see in. I always default back to Michael Johnson because he's the one that sort of pops into my head when it comes to like 200s and 400s. It's like
Yeah.
you look at his physical structure; he was very, very narrow, very vertical, very linear, and it even ran that way.
The
We
gift
would
of
never
like
want.
just tremendous amounts of anterior orientation to just
Yeah,
throw
exactly.
force into the
Yeah,
ground as quick as possible
yes,
at a high
yeah,
rate.
right. But he's gonna perform more of like a narrow ISA variation of a shoulder roll.
Well, it's
So we'd
interesting
roll
you
him
say
forward
that,
and back.
like, because what you typically see in high school, you have the kids who are just fast, who end up on the track
Yeah,
team that also are played for the football. And then in college, they
yeah,
end up being a tight end or a running back because they were wide.
right.
And sprinting
Yeah,
never felt good for them, but they were fast.
right.
So they just were
They're just
they were on the
fast.
track team. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
so
typically
we
what
have
you
to
see.
whenever we're having these discussions, the things that people need to recognize is that we're always talking about the extremes because they are just representative of the rules. They like
Right.
people go against the rules. Like again, the short stocky kid could be the fastest kid in his class, and therefore he becomes like a different type of an athlete. And then the higher the level he goes, he gets selected out, kind of like you were saying. It's like, oh, your physical structure kind of puts you in this category, right? Um, you know, Tim Tebow was not a typical structure for a drop back passer.
Yeah.
He looked like a running back or a tight end. In fact, he tried to come back and play as a tight end because he had the physical structure for that. Now, he didn't necessarily have the skill level because he didn't come up with those skills. And so it's much
Right.
more difficult to develop them later on in life. Right. But his physical structure kind of pointed him towards like, hey, maybe you'd be, a better tight end. Jim Kelly, quarterback Jim Kelly, was actually recruited as a linebacker at one point. That's
Mm,
how big a human being he was,
I didn't realize
right?
that.
And yeah, yeah, Penn State, I believe, which would be like linebacker university at the time. So, but again, it's like so. Now, had he trained in that direction, he could have become something else because he did have the foundational structure for it,
Right.
right? Yeah, but so,
Long term athletic discovery.
yeah, yeah, but but that's why we have all these different rolls on different axes, because they fit into different categories at different times. It's like, so changes of direction are going to be on more obliques. The vertical dimensions, like vertical jumping, top speed sprinting, are going to be more like the rolls are going to be on a more of a vertical axis.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's
The shape
let's
changes that we need for IRs. It's like you take your Play-Doh and you roll it out and you make the long skinny tube. It's like, that's why you do the long axis rolls, is because I'm trying to
right.
create that shape change.
Yeah, so let's like categorize things a little more clearly to kind of
Mm-hmm.
wrap things up here. When we're talking
Uh-huh.
about rolling, typically people think of rolling, they think of like sideline, long axis rolling. What is that? If we could write down what that is seeking to accomplish, like what are the main things that I'm trying to go after with a long axis
Uh-huh.
roll?
Okay. So I'm trying to be able to move through middle propulsion, which means that I have to have a representation of early. I have to be able to access the IR shape to go through the middle of the roll, because that's where the strongest ground contact will be.
Yeah,
I still need an early and middle and a late, but I'm exposing myself to a longer, like anytime you're rolling, you're going to be exposing yourself to a longer representation of middle propulsion.
sure.
I just need the two ends to create the shape to go there, and I need to be able to leave that position. And
Right.
that's why, so if we were used to use an arm bar as an example,
Mm-hmm.
it's a perfect representation of what we're talking about here. The longest duration in that type of a roll is through that middle propulsive phase. But we still have the two ends, so we can use the two ends to our advantage when we have deficits in either ER representation, because we
Okay.
got to start and finish. So we create those, right?
Right.
But it's always going to be a strong middle propulsive representation.
Okay. And now my more vertical rolling, like a dorsal sacral
Correct.
roll, head to tail
Yes.
along the spine,
Yes.
basically. Those are
Yes.
for what?
Pushing straight down into the ground, and changing your center of gravity, right? So we're no longer just pushing into the ground. We're actually trying to leave the ground under this circumstance, right? So when you think about just rolling from head to tail,
Yeah.
okay, your guts slam up into the diaphragm, and then they push down into the bottom of the pelvis. That's what you're doing. So this is
Yeah.
that if you look at the literature, you'll see the concept called visceral pistoning.
Yeah. I was just gonna say it's helping you create the piston effect of the guts.
Correct. Correct. All right. So I don't have to worry so much about the turn that would be associated with moving through middle. I would be in middle, and then I have to create the internal dynamics that allow me to leave the ground.
Okay. That's helpful. And then the last one that we used as an example was the oblique shoulder roll
Correct. These
scenarios.
are the
What are
oblique
those are for?
rolls.
And those are
Okay.
for
Okay, when we're talking about rolling from hip to shoulder, that's going to be axial driven.
so backwards.
Uh, so backwards, backwards would be an inhalation bias, and then forwards over your shoulder is going to be an exhalation bias.
Okay.
So keep that in mind.
Yep.
Okay. Now, if I was to lie on my back and I'm going to drive a long diagonal roll, now I'm actually using the extremity to drive the axial skeleton. So now we're including the extremity, because in certain cases I may only want I may not have the ability to position the extremity, but I can still work on the axial skeletal position. So this would be like the difference between a squat and a toe touch if we were doing an evaluation,
Right.
right? So if I'm looking at a toe touch deficit and I want to affect that toe touch deficit with a form of rolling, I'm going to use a hip to shoulder roll, because I'm emphasizing the proximal aspect in the axial skeleton. If I'm looking at a squat behavior, I need the extremity that's going to be included into that. And so I'm going to use an extremity driven type of roll.
Okay. So the oblique, the shoulder rolling. So that these sideline rolls is to it creates more time and space in order to which to put IR down.
Correct.
The front to back rolling allows the ground to help you create the sort of pistoning effect of the guts
Yes, sir.
in a vertical dimension.
Yes.
And then the oblique rolling I still don't have like one thing that I'm honing in on as the reason to use it.
It's a bigger turn.
Okay.
It's a
So
bigger turn.
it's still the pistoning. It's still helping with the pistoning effect, but
Uh-huh.
on an axis that you could help line up with someone's helical orientation.
Well, it would be that would be that like the most effective roll would be on your helical angle,
Right.
right?
So if
But it's
you
the biggest turn. This is the biggest. So each one has a variation of turning,
yeah.
right? So sideline rolling doesn't have as big a turn as say the supine to prone and the prone to supine rolls because
Mm-hmm.
those are bigger turns. There's a bigger gradient associated with the anterior posterior dimensions of the axial skeleton under that circumstance, right?
Right.
So
So
again, middle
a
P doesn't have the same gradient. Like
right.
rolling through middle doesn't have the same gradient. But if I'm rolling on my helical axis, those are the biggest turns. Like I need the biggest differential between the two sides to roll on a helical axis because that's where the biggest turn is.
Okay. So what I could use as a stepwise progression for say like an athlete warming up could be a front to back like a dorsal sacral roll, straight up
Yep.
and down, and then
Yep.
something side lying, and then finishing with like a walking shoulder roll, like
Yeah.
just walking into a shoulder roll after
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
progress to it, of course, but
Yeah. But
like
yeah,
just a
absolutely.
full on shoulder roll from standing, get up,
Uh
be
huh.
able to yeah,
Uh
okay.
huh. Uh huh.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a
Yeah.
useful representation. I think we
Yeah,
really
like
kind of
if you had
hammered
to
home.
generalize it, let's just say and here's the other cool thing. Let's just say you know nothing about this person.
Yeah.
Okay, you know nothing about them. We could take those three roles and we can use them diagnostically,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? It's like all you have to be able to do is recognize where the deficit would be under the circumstance. And
Right.
so we got somebody that's a lousy dorsal sacral roller. Okay, they can't move their guts up and down. So
Yeah.
that gives us an idea of what shape that they actually have, right? If I can't roll like a log roll looks like a refrigerator, then you know you don't
Yeah.
have the AP dimension and they can't create the IR that they need
I
for
was
middle
just
propulsion. If they can't roll over a shoulder, they can't turn.
yeah, I'm thinking of athletes. There's a lot of narrow, very compressed, narrow, very high performing athletes. I try to get to do
Mm-hmm.
dorsal sacral rolls, and the first move is
Yeah.
just like onto their back. It's just like a this. They just like there's no.
it looks like you're rolling a box.
Yeah, well, they can't even get their hips off the ground because they just go back and they're just flat, and
And they
that's
just
it.
flatten.
There's yeah,
Exactly.
but that's
Exactly
diagnostic
right.
too because you know that lower posterior is probably
Absolutely.
closed for business because
Yes.
it's just flat
Yes.
as a pancake. But yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there was a lot of good nuggets and tips in this one, Bill.
I'm gonna get sick to my stomach.
Just full of rolling nuggets. Well, we didn't wax too philosophical this time. We actually gave like pretty good examples and
It was pretty good
practical
practical.
stuff.
Yes.
Okay,
Very
so
much so.
what should we haven't asked anyone for a question in the comments in a long time.
Oh
What should
gosh,
we?
We
What
haven't.
I want to know some of what people's favorite Saturday morning cartoons were.
Oh wow. Wow.
I have some good ones.
Better
I
than
was
Hong
like
Kong
there's
Phooey?
yeah, I mean Hong Kong. Those were always like those were on at night on Nickelodeon. Those are always on at
Oh,
night
so
for
those are
me.
my Saturday morning cartoons,
Well,
man.
because you're old, Bill.
Well, Bugs Bunny Roadrunner, it has to be the greatest compendium of Saturday morning cartoons, like hands down,
Yeah,
like
yeah, those are
without
great.
question,
Looney Tunes.
without question, without question. Looney Tunes,
Yeah,
because it was like 1953, I believe, is when they first came out.
it's very
Yeah, and they were
yeah. There's
huge when I was a kid.
yeah children's
Huge
cartoons,
when I was a kid.
40s even, I believe.
I
Yeah.
think it was 1950. Don't quote me, but I think it's 1953.
50s the 50s is when that's when like Disney was started, right? That was like the Disney time. That was when Disney
Yeah,
World is
probably
like
because it was
fifty-five,
black and
58,
white.
something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And then the greatest fun fact of all time for the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner is that one person did all the voices.
Yeah.
Mel Blanc. Mel
Yeah,
Blanc
Mel
did all
Blanc,
the voices.
the man, the
Every
myth, the
single one.
legend, Mel Blanc.
Yes. Yes. And who did not like carrots? and yet he had to chew carrots
They could have
to
picked
do Bugs
something
Bunny.
else.
They
They could have,
tried. They actually
yeah,
so there's an interview. There's an interview with Mel Blanc where they said, yeah, they tried rutabaga and
yeah.
like all different. And they said they couldn't
Rutabaga
get the
raw would
sound.
be, yeah,
They couldn't get the sound right, and so he literally had to chew carrots, and he hated carrots.
yeah. That's fine. All right.
That's a commitment to your art, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Cool. See you on the network. Anyone that's still
There
watching.
you go. That's still there, Dale.